If you've ever wondered why your city has a housing shortage, despite having empty lots, abandoned buildings, and sprawling single-family neighborhoods, the answer is often zoning laws. These regulations determine what can be built where, and in many American cities, they make it illegal to build the kind of housing that people actually need and can afford. Today, I'm going to walk you through how zoning laws work, how they evolved to restrict housing supply, and why they're a major reason housing became unaffordable in cities across America. Zoning laws are regulations that divide cities into different zones and specify what types of buildings and activities are allowed in each zone. There are typically several categories: residential, commercial, industrial, and sometimes mixed use. Within residential zones, there are usually subcategories. Single-family residential, often called R1, typically allows only detached single-family homes. Multifamily residential zones allow duplexes, townhouses, or apartment buildings. The specific rules vary by city, but the pattern is consistent. Zoning regulations control several key factors. First, they control use, what type of building is allowed. Second, they control density, how many units can be built per acre. Third, they control physical characteristics, minimum lot sizes, maximum building heights, setback requirements from property lines, parking requirements, and other specifications. Here's a concrete example of how this works. Let's say you own a large lot in a neighborhood zoned R1 for single-family homes. The zoning might require a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet, a maximum height of 35 feet, roughly 2 stories, setbacks of at least 15 feet from the street and 10 feet from side property lines, and 2 off-street parking spaces. Now let's say there's high demand for housing in your neighborhood. You'd like to build a small apartment building with 6 units on your lot to help meet that demand and generate rental income. Even though you own the land, even though there's demand for housing, you cannot legally build that apartment building. The zoning prohibits it. You can only build one single-family home. This is how zoning restricts housing supply. It limits what can be built regardless of demand or owner preference. Zoning laws weren't always this restrictive. Let's look at how this evolved. In the early 1900s, most American cities had very little zoning. Buildings of different types and uses were mixed together. You might have a corner store, an apartment building, and single-family homes all on the same block. This organic mixing is how most pre-1920s neighborhoods developed. Zoning began in the early 1900s with the stated goal of separating incompatible uses. The classic example was keeping smelly, noisy factories away from residential neighborhoods. This made sense and was generally beneficial for public health and quality of life. But zoning quickly expanded beyond separating industrial uses from residential areas. By the 1920s and accelerating in the post-World War II era, many cities began implementing single-family zoning across large portions of their residential land. The explicitly stated purpose, documented in planning documents and court cases, was often to preserve neighborhood character and protect property values. But historical research has shown that racial and economic exclusion were significant motivating factors. Single-family zoning on large lots effectively made neighborhoods expensive and therefore accessible only to wealthy, predominantly white families. By the 1960s and 1970s, most American cities had zoned the majority of their residential land exclusively for single-family detached houses. In many cities today, 70 to 80% or more of residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family detached houses. This means on the vast majority of residential land in these cities, it is illegal to build apartments, townhouses, duplexes, or any other housing type that could accommodate more people at a lower cost per unit. Let's look at how single-family-only zoning creates housing shortages and drives up prices. First, it limits the number of homes that can exist. If a neighborhood is zoned for single-family homes only with minimum lot sizes of 5,000 square feet, a 10-acre parcel can have at most about 87 homes. If that same parcel could have townhouses or small apartment buildings, it might accommodate 300 or more homes. The zoning directly limits how many people can live in the area. Second, it makes each individual home more expensive. When you can only build one house per lot and lots must be large, the land cost per home is high. A 5,000 square foot lot might cost $100,000 in a desirable area. That cost gets built into the home price. If you could build 6 townhouses on that same land, the land cost per unit drops to about $17,000, making each home potentially much more affordable. Third, it prevents the natural evolution of neighborhoods. Historically, neighborhoods would densify over time as cities grew. A single-family home might be converted to a duplex or torn down and replaced with a small apartment building. This organic densification provided more housing in desirable locations. Single-family zoning freezes neighborhoods at low density permanently. Fourth, it forces new housing to the outer suburbs where land is cheaper and zoning is less restrictive. This creates sprawl, longer commutes, more traffic, and higher infrastructure costs. It also means people who want to live near urban job centers, schools, and amenities are priced out because there's literally not enough housing allowed near those locations. Let's look at a specific example. San Francisco is often cited as having severe housing costs. The median home price is well over $1 million. Meanwhile, about 60% of San Francisco's residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family homes. In these vast areas, it's illegal to build anything denser than one house per lot. This artificially constrains supply in one of the highest demand cities in America. The same pattern exists in Los Angeles, 75% single-family zoning, Seattle, 65%, and many other expensive cities. Large portions of these cities are legally off-limits to the kind of housing, apartments, townhouses, that could make them more affordable.
Beyond single-family-only zoning, several other zoning requirements increase housing costs. Parking requirements. Many cities require new housing to include a specific number of parking spaces per unit. Often it's 1 or 2 spaces per apartment, even in areas with good public transit where many residents don't own cars. Building parking, especially underground or structured parking, is extremely expensive. It can add $50,000 to $75,000 per space in construction costs. This cost gets passed through to rent or purchase prices. In cities where many residents use transit or walk, mandatory parking requirements force developers to build expensive parking that may sit empty while making the housing itself more expensive. Height limits. Many neighborhoods have strict height limits, often 35 to 45 feet, which typically allows 3 to 4 stories maximum. This limits how many homes can be built on a given piece of land. Near transit stations or in commercial districts where taller buildings would make sense, height limits prevent the kind of density that could provide substantial new housing supply. Minimum lot sizes. Requirements that lots be a minimum size, 5,000 or 10,000 square feet or more, mean that land in desirable areas gets divided into fewer, more expensive lots. Setback requirements. Regulations requiring buildings to be set back a certain distance from property lines reduce the buildable area of each lot, limiting how much housing can be constructed. Individually, each of these requirements might seem reasonable. Collectively, they significantly constrain housing supply and increase costs. Understanding who benefits from restrictive zoning helps explain why it persists. Who benefits? Current homeowners in single-family neighborhoods benefit in several ways. Restrictive zoning limits housing supply, which keeps demand high and pushes up home values. If you already own a home, your property becomes more valuable as an investment. Restrictive zoning also prevents changes to neighborhood character. If you like living in a quiet, low-density neighborhood, zoning ensures it stays that way by preventing denser development. Wealthy landowners benefit because their large lots in desirable areas become increasingly valuable as supply is restricted elsewhere. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is often driven by homeowners who benefit from the status quo and oppose any changes that might affect their property values or neighborhood character. Who loses? Young people trying to buy their first home lose because artificial supply restrictions make homes more expensive. Housing that might cost $300,000 in an unrestricted market might cost $600,000 when supply is limited by zoning. Renters lose because restricted supply pushes up rents. When there aren't enough apartments, landlords can charge more. Families with moderate incomes lose because they're priced out of neighborhoods with good schools, short commutes, and amenities. They're forced to move farther out, increasing commute times and costs. The environment loses because sprawl development consumes more land, increases driving, and creates more emissions than compact development would. Cities lose because they can't house their essential workers. Teachers, nurses, police officers, firefighters often can't afford to live in the cities where they work. In recent years, some cities have begun reforming zoning laws. Minneapolis eliminated single-family zoning citywide in 2018, allowing duplexes and triplexes on any residential lot. Oregon passed a statewide law in 2019 requiring cities to allow duplexes on single-family lots. California has passed several laws allowing accessory dwelling units and reducing parking requirements. These reforms are relatively new, and it's too early to see their full effects on housing affordability. But they represent a shift in thinking about zoning and housing supply. The basic economic principle is straightforward. When demand exceeds supply, prices rise. Zoning laws that restrict supply in high-demand areas make housing expensive. Relaxing those restrictions allows more housing to be built, which helps moderate prices. Critics of zoning reform worry about neighborhood character, traffic, parking, and other concerns. Supporters argue that affordable housing for people who need it is more important than preserving low density in high-demand areas. This is fundamentally a question of priorities. Should zoning protect existing homeowners' investment values and neighborhood preferences, or should it allow enough housing to be built so that people can afford to live in their own cities? Zoning laws, particularly single-family-only zoning covering the majority of residential land in many cities, restrict housing supply by making it illegal to build apartments, townhouses, or other denser housing types in vast areas of cities where people want to live. This artificial constraint on supply drives up housing costs. Combined with parking requirements, height limits, and minimum lot sizes, zoning regulations significantly increase the cost of housing. Some cities have begun reforming these laws, but change is gradual and faces opposition from homeowners who benefit from the current system. Understanding how zoning restricts supply helps explain why housing became so expensive in many American cities. If you found this useful, share it. Leave a comment about zoning in your city, and subscribe for more videos on why costs increased. I'll see you in the next one.